Once upon a time, there was a man named Jacob who had 2 wives named Leah and Rachel, and they bore 12 sons. Out of the 12 sons, Jacob clearly loved the 2 sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, more than the rest. And predictably, this made family life very complicated. This salacious drama, worthy of a daytime television series, did eventually reach a breaking point. Joseph was sold into slavery, while his 10 half-brothers lied to Dad, saying that he had been killed by a wild animal. Then, in an astonishing rise to power, Joseph went from slave to prisoner to prime minister of the mightiest empire on earth, Egypt. Later, a severe famine and Joseph helped reconcile this dysfunctional family together, and Jacob's whole family immigrated into Egypt, including Jacob's grand total of 70 sons and daughters. Yes, things were a lot different back then. The Pharaoh welcomed these refugees with admirable enthusiasm, and they were assigned some prime real estate in the land of Goshen. Jacob, then Joseph and all his brothers got old and died, but this clan kept growing and growing. Eventually, the Egyptian empire had a new political administration, and they perceived the thriving Israelites as an internal threat to national security. They oppressed the Hebrews, which is another name for Israelites, by putting them into slavery and ordered the killing of all the baby boys. One of those baby boys was rescued from the genocide by an Egyptian princess. He grew up as an Egyptian prince, killed an Egyptian who was beating one of his fellow Hebrews, ran away into the wilderness to avoid criminal charges, met a beautiful woman at a well, got married, had a family, and became a sheep farmer. His name, of course, is Moses. Meanwhile, God had not forgotten the Israelites in slavery, and he heard their groaning. God recruited Moses from a burning bush to help go get the Hebrews out of Egypt. This was a convoluted and frustrating political process, but eventually a spectacular set of horrific plagues convinced the Pharaoh to finally release the Israelites. It had been 430 years since Jacob's family immigrated to Egypt, but now they left in a hurry. On their way out, they asked the petrified Egyptians for silver, gold, and clothing, and gently plundered their oppressors. The Israelites left the familiarity of civilization and ventured out into the wilderness. Yahweh went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The Pharaoh and his administration had second thoughts, and they sent their powerful military to bring those refugees back. An angel of God, moving pillars of cloud, darkness, and the separation of the sea into walls of water allowed the Israelites to escape. They came out the other side with a renewed outlook on life with Yahweh and the leadership of his servant Moses. The Israelites now faced the new reality of life in the wilderness. They had escaped the tyranny of the Egyptian empire, but now what? It had been several centuries since their ancient ancestor Jacob had immigrated to Egypt. The magnificent empire they had finally broken free from was relentlessly oppressive, but it had still been their home for a long time. Egyptian civilization had long influenced how they thought, how they acted, how they lived, and how they ate. Their imaginations had long been shaped by the context and place of their time. As they were literally heading into the middle of nowhere, what was next? At first, they eyed the barren wilderness around them with only mild concern. After all, this Yahweh God clearly had extraordinary power to protect them from any harm that could befall them. And Moses, their beloved native son, obviously had the ear of this God, and he was leading them into the desert. But the hours of trudging passed by slowly, and the canteens were rapidly going empty. After 3 days, a small body of bitter water was spotted, and the mood of the group started to get dour. And they grumbled at Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. They chugged the delicious water and refilled those canteens. Then the Israelites came to the grove of Elim, where 12 springs and 70 palm trees provided some water and some shade, and more importantly, some peace of mind. They eventually set out from the oasis of Elim and reluctantly re-entered the desert. It had now been a month since the Israelites had left Egypt, and Exodus chapter 16, verse 3 tells us, the Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by Yahweh's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." These are dramatic words. And we, as God's people here today, may be inclined to judge them sternly for these petulant complaints. These people had recently witnessed a series of supernatural events that we will likely never see in our own lifetimes. Given the circumstances, we could consider their lack of faith rather exasperating. After all, we would never complain and doubt so needlessly ourselves, would we? Clearly, the euphoria of their newly found freedom was rapidly wearing off. All of the gold and silver they had plundered from the Egyptians was still jingling in their pockets, but it was useless for purchasing groceries. The nagging and relentless reality of hunger was digging in. The Israelites were in the harshness of the desert, and they were immersed in a life of precarious vulnerability. A place where stable resources and visible support systems did not exist. There are no Costco's or superstores in the wilderness. It is in this moment of vulnerability and need that they idealize their past and fondly remember the pots of meat and tableaus of food that never actually existed for them in Egypt. The Israelites may have physically escaped the shadow of empire, but escaping empire's hold on their imaginations remained an ongoing and formidable task. The immersive reality of the empire, despite the oppressiveness that had caused them to cry out in Exodus chapter 2, still deeply lingered in their consciousness, because that reality is all that they had ever really known. This Yahweh God was still a relatively new reality for them, with only a few dusty old stories from their distant ancestors, the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were probably still wondering about this God who had rescued them. For all the sensational scenes God's people had witnessed, they were still getting to know Yahweh. There were some reasonable questions of God's character that remained and lingered, given their unstable circumstances. Through their grumbling and mounting fears of starvation in the desert, they were asking a vital question: who is this God, Yahweh? As God's people here today, we too have that experience of empire's hold on our imaginations. Probably much more so because we still remain immersed in it. The Israelites were merely dreaming of an abundant food supply they never had access to, while we here are the great beneficiaries of all the astonishing supply lines in place, something that the early COVID pandemic briefly shook up. As Canadians in 2024, we are among the wealthiest societies in human history. God's people, both past and present, are sometimes called to live in precarious vulnerability and to live in freedom by relying entirely on Yahweh. This is not an easy task. For the ancient Israelites, this meant trusting that Yahweh could be counted on for their basic day-to-day needs and leaving their foolish longing for familiar Egypt behind. For us here today, the radical ways God is calling to us to may clash precariously with our longing and trust in the comfortable and seemingly secure ways of empire here in the Western world. Where does our trust actually lie remains the ancient question. Given the mob situation developing in Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 and 3, we may expect Moses to hike up the nearest mountain and plead God for material aid. Yet it is Yahweh who initiates in verse 4. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "I will rain bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." God seems quite unperturbed by the grumbling of his people and the doubts they were having. The primary question of basic sustenance was answered immediately, and the food was on its way. The promise was made that Yahweh's provision would be trustworthy and reliable. The people were to go out and gather just enough for that day and will receive twice as much on the sixth day in order to rest on the seventh day. An echo of the creation narrative in Genesis and God resting on the seventh day. This contrasts to the Egyptian empire, where impressive store cities were relentlessly built 7 days a week with their slave labor for the sole purpose of storing enormous quantities of food. For God's people living out in the wilderness, essentially on a spiritual retreat that never ends, life was intended to be lived day by day with total reliance on Yahweh's life-giving provision. The nerves of Moses and his co-leader Aaron were understandably a little frayed at this point. And after receiving instructions from Yahweh, they tell the people in verses 6 to 8, "In the evening you will know that it was Yahweh who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of Yahweh, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was Yahweh when he gives you meat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against Yahweh." Then the people were called to come before Yahweh, and verse 10 reads, "While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of Yahweh appearing in the cloud." As much as we would like to, it is probably difficult for us to imagine what this cloud looked like. But the glory of God proclaimed the sovereignty of Yahweh over this wilderness situation. This was a visible reminder to the faint hearts, sluggish imaginations, and growling stomachs of the Israelites that the God they were following was tangible, real, and reliable. Yahweh was present and had not led them into the wilderness to die of starvation. In verse 12, Yahweh affirms the message of provision and care to Moses once again. I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am Yahweh, your God. We can imagine the people returning to their tents and collecting additional fuel to build up their fires in preparation for the roasting of meat. There were probably still some cynics amongst them muttering their skepticism of the situation. Where was the meat going to come from? What kind of meat was it going to be? Will there really be enough for everyone to eat? Is a herd of wild goats going to come roughshod over our entire camp? As the evening drew near in verse 13, they suddenly saw a swarm of birds swirling in the distance. A cloud of quail covered the camp like those dreaded locusts once covered Egypt. What a party there must have been that night. The smell of barbecued meat wafting throughout the whole camp. The sizzle of the fat dripping off the birds and into the coals of the fire. Everyone stuffing their faces. A communal meal of celebration for Yahweh's faithfulness to them as a people. For the moment, at least, all questions of Yahweh's trustworthiness were happily put to rest amidst the growing piles of quail bones. An abundant feast far surpassing the grandest of meals they had ever enjoyed under the stinginess of the Egyptian empire. God's people fell asleep with full bellies and joyful hearts, with dreams of what the bread from Yahweh might look like. The morning arrived and there was a layer of dew around the camp. Verses 14 and 15 read, when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread that Yahweh has given you to eat. If there is such thing as an unspectacular miracle, this might be it. The people were probably hoping for delicious loaves of bread floating in from the sky, and instead they were blessed with frosted flakes lying all over the desert floor. Flakes that will need to be painstakingly collected day by day without letting sand and dirt mingle into the mix. A boring chore that will continue for years and years to come for the Israelites, but a reoccurring daily miracle nonetheless. When considering this text, we may hear the Lord's Prayer echoing from the New Testament. Give us this day our daily bread. Through quail and frosted flakes, Yahweh has answered the grumbling of his people and resolved the crisis of scarcity quite convincingly. It is with some curiosity that we consider the food given directly from God. And verse 31 reads, the people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. I am quite proud to say that I once had the unique opportunity to actually taste manna. About 30 years ago, in a Sunday school classroom, I was given some leftover manna to try. I can report that its appearance and flavor was remarkably similar to that of saltine crackers with a little butter spread on them. Numbers chapter 11, verse 8 says that the manna tasted like olive oil. Psalm 78 celebrates the manna in verse 25 by proclaiming, men ate the bread of angels. He sent them all the food they could eat. In the human experience, food is very important. We spend a lot of time and effort to grow food or make money to buy food. We make extensive lists and we wander the grocery store aisles weekly with almost a ferocious intensity. We schedule our entire lives around eating breakfast and lunch and dinner. We daydream about food, or at least I do. We talk enthusiastically about food. We watch people cook on the Food Network with shows like Beat Bobby Flay and Chopped and Diners, Drive-Ins and Dives. We sometimes seek to honor and get to know others by inviting them over for dinner. We mark special occasions with a meal: weddings, funerals, Christmas, Easter, and this weekend, Thanksgiving. Why do we mark these special occasions with food? Because food is deeply connected to our practice of memory. Earlier in Exodus chapter 12, the Israelites were engaged in the original Passover feast, a highly significant meal still celebrated today. Now, once again, here in chapter 16, food is again connected to the practice of memory. Verse 33 reads, "So Moses said to Aaron, 'Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before Yahweh to be kept for the generations to come.'" Eventually, the manna and the tablets of the law will sit side by side before Yahweh in the Ark of the Covenant. It is remarkable that this jar of breadcrumbs came before any laws were even given, and then sat next to the very stone tablets of the law. Perhaps they are still sitting there side by side, the ark being lost in history somewhere. For us as well-fed contemporary believers, this ancient story of the quail and the manna from heaven, while certainly a nice story of the miraculous, may seem a little unrelated and even irrelevant to our everyday lives. At the moment, we generally do not lack for food. And indeed, the structures of empire literally bring it to us from the far reaches of the globe. Lemons from South Africa, grapes from Chile, seafood from China. Yet, the daily provision of the manna still lingers as a foundational faith memory in our prayer life when we utter in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us our daily bread." I'd like to invite the band to come up at this point. The manna also serves as a reminder of our practice of the Lord's Supper and the presence of the bread alongside the cup. And the day may come once again when we will literally hope and pray for quail and manna to come miraculously from the heavens. Something that Jesus fulfilled once again when he multiplied the loaves and fishes. So this Thanksgiving weekend, remember. If you are enjoying a ham and cheese sandwich with mustard and some carrot sticks in the quiet of your kitchen, remember. If you are gathered together with family and gazing at a splendid feast of mashed potatoes, turkey, and stuffing, remember. Remember in a time of plenty that there have been times of scarcity for God's people. Remember that the magnificence of the empire pulls and tugs on the imaginations of God's people, even through food. It did so for the ancient Israelites, and it still does for us today. Remember where your trust should lie. Remember that our ultimate allegiance lies with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Remember that the memories and imaginations of God's people are to be shaped differently than those around them. Remember the quail and frosted flakes and taste the food, enjoy the food, and give thanks and know that Yahweh is your God. Let us conclude with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors. and do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. Amen.